Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Fired Up. I'm your host, Dimitra Theophanis, and this is the Art Alliance for Contemporary Glass Education series. We do have a lot of new faces here today, so I'm just going to real briefly talk about the Art Alliance. Our mission is to raise the visibility of art glass and encourage its appreciation in the community. And we do that through grants and scholarships, through educational programs like Fired Up, as well as a lot of member-only program like our Friday meetups and our annual glass tours. So board member Howard Cohen will go ahead and put the link to our website in the chat. And if anyone has questions, you can message us or go to the website. All right, without further ado, I am just thrilled to have Toots Zynsky with us here today. She received her BFA from the Rhode Island School of Design in 1973 and was one of the only women in a group of pioneering artists that studied with Dale Chihuly, who made studio glass a worldwide phenomenon. And she worked in conjunction with Chihuly to participate in the founding and development of Pilchuck Glass School. So she's really iconic, not only in her incredibly innovative work, but also in terms of what she's done for education within the field of glass. So we are grateful on many fronts to have her. So without further ado, Toots, you can go ahead and take it away and start sharing your screen when you're ready.
Okie dokie, here we go. Oh. Where's it doing it? So we were having a bit of problem with sound before. So if any of you have a problem hearing, I'm going to start with a brief video. It's actually about 5 minutes. And it just is a walkthrough of actually part of my studio, my old studio, because the new studio isn't set up yet to walk you through it, unless you like climbing over boxes. So if any of you have a problem hearing, could you just enter it into your chat, and Dimitra will give me a heads up. So here we go. Without further ado, some of you have seen parts of this, so you can take a nap if you want. But I've really...
So now we're downstairs.
Okay, here we go.
And these are some of the extra stacks of thread. We always try and keep ahead of the supply that I need. But here's where it really starts, which is with the cane, which comes from Milano, Italy, from what used to be Moretti and is now Effetri. And they make the most beautiful colors, and it's a softer glass and works at a lower temperature. So it's very advantageous to the work that I do. So they make endless amounts of colors. So I have always a choice of really beautiful, beautiful colors to work with. And above, you'll see some of the archival storage that I keep here of my work. So I'm lucky to have the space to be able to keep it there here. So now we're going to move to the thread pulling machine and show you how the magic works. So you can see the tip of the cane starting to heat up. And when it makes a certain amount of liquid, ball, then Nicole's going to go in and start it running. So we start with a rub like this. It's about the same width as your finger, small finger, and then we pull it to this very flexible thread, and each one of these rods, which is a meter long, holds approximately 7 kilometers of thread. And even a small piece, we've calculated, takes about 32 kilometers of thread. So we hold thousands of these a year. So we figured out we could have wrapped around the world many, many times over the past 40 years.
So this is just the finish work, which is very, very minor on each piece, just to make sure it sits perfectly flat. And this piece is actually bigger than it looks in this because my head's closer to the camera. So it takes a couple of people to be balancing it. It's, of course, my least favorite part of the work. And it gets a shower. It has to be a really, really hard driven water to clean out between all the threads.
So that's the short version of washing a piece. And then it just has to drip dry for a few hours before we can cook. Okay, so now we've moved to the photo room. I've photographed my own pieces practically since the beginning because it gives me a really special opportunity to just really look at every aspect of the piece and find out, you know, what I think worked about it, what are the best views, what maybe didn't work as well about it. So I just do a complete turnaround of the piece. So up and down to give an idea of what the piece will look like seen from different heights. And we can send people for turnarounds of every piece. So it's a really valuable part of my learning process in making every piece and then moving on to the next piece and, you know, hopefully getting it even better the next time. So now we're downstairs.
Oops. Oh, there we go. So again, this is what I look at every day. I never put it in the, you know, as a rainbow, because taking colors out and putting them back, suddenly I'm putting colors juxtaposed that I might never have thought about juxtaposing before. And it's always a great inspiration. This is just a close-up of the thread pulling machine, the electronic eye. Just a little overview. So we have 2 machines and they're usually running every day. And this is some of the original electronics. When I showed this to the MIT students, of course, they all burst out laughing. This is now so archaic. In 1983, it was not archaic at all, but it still works. So I don't have to change it. Just a quick view close up of, you know, my shelves and shelves of stacks of threads. And in moving, I moved the upstairs thread supply and the downstairs thread supply together and realized that I may have enough thread already to last me the rest of my life. Um, so we'll see what happens with that. So this is a very early piece. Demetra asked me to preface this. Some of my lectures start with my original glass blowing pieces because that was my original training. It was the only thing available in terms of studying glass in 1970. But I quickly moved through that because I love the medium. It's just amazing to work with. I've been working with it now for 50 years. And so this is my 50th anniversary of working with glass. Welcome to my party. And I quickly learned, we were very much encouraged to experiment by Dale, who was a great teacher, by the way. And so we all started experimenting and learning as much as we could. And people started, I started pouring glass and stretching it. And then I did research about pot de verre. Dale was always providing us with just myriads of information and encouraging us to go to the library, do research. And so we all started learning as much as we could and taking kind of different avenues. If you think about who was in that first class, it was those years, it was Dan Daly, Jamie Carpenter, Thurman Statham, me, Bruce Chow. I mean, the list goes on, and then followed by Michael Glancy, Howard Benche, and everyone developed in very different directions. I kept learning as much as I could and was still doing returned to glass blowing in 1979. I stopped for 6 years and was just making very ephemeral sculpture in outdoors, in indoor large spaces with very ephemeral materials like cloth, even cheesecloth, wire. And then I needed to make one element of a sculpture. I realized it had to be out of hot glass. So that got me hooked again. And I started blowing glass again, but quickly started moving away from that and combining it with fused parts, which led to fusing like these mesh-like, more three-dimensional structures with hand-pulled thread, crushed and fused, and with pieces blown into them and around them. And that finally led to just exclusively experimenting with thread, because I met an artist inventor from Holland named Matthijs Tjernsten van Manen, and he said, "Why are you pulling this thread by hand? This is archaic." And I had to agree that it was. And so he first made a contraption that pulled glass to thread in the most rudimentary fashion. It looked like a Rube Goldberg invention. And then he and I started researching together because he really didn't know anything about glass. We both were fairly mechanical, and he was very good with electronics, which I knew nothing about. So we started researching and traveling and going up to Corning and then traveling to Italy, and then I wound up staying in Holland. So this is one of the first pieces that I made successfully in Holland. And I had a studio in a souterrain, with 2 tiny windows in it. So it was really a cellar. And so this piece was called Swan in the Cellar. So it was sort of autobiographical, even though I don't consider myself a swan, but I did feel like a little out of place in a cellar. And I've always loved birds, and this felt like holding a bird. This is a piece, okay, much, much later. That was in 1983. This is in 2013, I believe. And it's when I was doing a lot of overlaying with the threads and started realizing that created this beautiful feathering effect. And it's just an optical effect of glass. And this is what causes it. So on the left, on the top left, you just see transparent, clear cane. And on the right is what's called filigrana. And this one happens to be a black and crystal filigrana. So it's black coated with crystal. And this is a magnified view of what happens even when I pull this cane to thread. It remains exactly the same proportionally. But as you start overlaying any transparent color over a filigrana, you start getting these beautiful feathered effects. And when you do it perpendicular, you get none at all. So I started really focusing on using this more and more as much as I could, because it's quite beautiful. So here's the detail of that feathering effect. And you see that it's very, very similar to what happens in certain feathers of birds. So these were some of the largest pieces when I started making these kind of winged pieces. They're about close to 3 feet across, actually. And this is just a brief run through of a piece. You've already seen the very beginning with the cane, the thread pulling. And so I pull the thread in my studio because no one else produces this kind of thread, not this quality and not this thinness and not with this glass. So we produce finally my raw material, and that's when I get to start to work. So here I am just in some middle stage of laying out a piece. So you're going to see the same piece from start to finish. This is a brief diagram of what happens when the threads first are set on top of each other, and then as they melt and they're sinking down into each other, they actually become prismatic. They become random crystalline shapes, even very minutely, but they are. And it's what causes the multiple refraction of light through my pieces. So even a piece that's actually transparent doesn't look transparent. You can't see through it because of the thousands of refractions of light as it passes through the piece. And of course, some of the pieces are partially transparent, partially translucent, and partially opaque, or all of any of the above. But what also happens is that when you see these little red dots, that's an indication of where air remains trapped as the threads sink down onto each other as they're fusing. And it actually, although glass has no crystalline structure, I have created a crystalline structure with glass, I discovered. And those tiny tubes of air passing through the piece actually give it a specific linear structure in one direction. And I use that when I'm forming the pieces, because it helps me make better forms by either working with it or against it. So you see the shadow in the middle of the piece. There are many, many layers, even on a almost unicolored piece, but there are many, many layers of color creating subtle transformations. So you see right there, there are at least 3 layers of color, but this piece actually has 5 different colors in it, feathering out because the thread is so fine, I can finely feather and grade colors with it. And we're about to put the whole piece, including the ceramic fiber board underneath of it, which it's been laid out on, into the kiln. You see in the kiln is the first very simple form that I'm going to be slumping eventually into. But first the piece has to fuse for approximately 3.5 to 4.5 hours, depending on its size. And it takes, at this point, 2 people to just be loading the piece in the kiln. That weighs a lot and it's just awkward. And if I tried to do it myself, I would probably spill the whole piece off the board. And I have some preliminary forms. I refer to them as pillows. I make them. And that's going to be a preliminary forming of the edge. Glass has a fantastic memory, which sometimes is wonderful and sometimes it's not. So you'll see what's going to happen. After the piece is fused, I start inserting them around the edge. So the piece is closed, it starts to fuse. While this is fusing, I usually am starting another piece or continuing work on another piece. So there's a constant, circular motion forward. So here I am inserting those pieces. This is the same piece. Interestingly, red glass when it's hot looks black. So these curves around the edge, even if I were to remove these and slump the glass back flat, when I transfer this to the first round form, the glass would retain that memory, and I would have curves as I'm slumping it down into the form. It's a fascinating substance to work with. So here I've transferred, I'm sorry, I'm missing a slide here. I've transferred that flat piece. I've taken the board back out of the kiln quickly, transferred it back over this form, and it's already slumping down in. It happens quite quickly. And there I've got a little bit of an overslump, so I'm going to go back in and pull that fold that's gone too deep. I'm going to pull that back out. It's all very fast work. I learned how to do this in part from having blown glass and going constantly back to the furnace to reheat the piece and then bringing it back to the bench, working on it till it gets too cold to work, going back and reheating it. It never occurred to me when I started fusing and slumping glass that I couldn't do that. So I did. And people were the first students I was teaching that were so surprised when I did it. I was demonstrating a pill check. They all literally jumped back 3 feet and gasped. And I'm like, what is wrong with you? And I, worked on the piece and put it back in the kiln. And they said, we thought you were going to break the piece. And I said, why? And then I realized that maybe none of them had ever blown glass, and they hadn't. So one of the great advantages of a place like Pilchuck is that there is every possibility of glass forming there. So I walked them across the lawn to observe glass blowing, and it really helped them understand better how to do, thermoforming and fusing and thermoforming with glass. So after the first firing, the piece comes out of the kiln. This is Emily, an intern from France, and it needs some, very fine touch-up work and some cleaning, but not washing yet. We can't wash it. I found out the hard way that very early on, that at this stage I washed a piece to get the fine powder of plaster off of it. And when I went to do the next stage of firing, the piece came out of the kiln and it was full of giant bubbles. And indeed, those tiny capillary tubes of air had sucked in the water. And when the kiln heated up to its high temperature, the water, of course, expanded and made a bubble. So I had to laugh at myself that I hadn't thought of that. And now we just clean it dry. Then it goes back into the kiln again. So this is its second firing. So the piece is cold right now that I'm resetting it. And then here it is slumping again. You see it's turned black because it's so hot. And I continued to form it with anything I, have in my hand to get the form I want. And it's slumping, slumping, slumping. So here's the final piece. So that was from flat. So you've seen it now from pulled thread to flat layout to final form. And that piece went to a special exhibition at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris in 2015. And it's quite a big piece, ultimately. So I've had the opportunity to do some wonderful residencies, and it gives me a chance to have access to a facility that has hot glass, all kinds of different glass forming possibilities. And I do love, I enjoy the activity of blowing glass and working with a team and experimenting. So these are just some experiments that I was able to do, incorporating crushed thread and torching it or pre-fusing it, and then torching it onto pieces as they were being blown. And I love the result. It kind of reminds me of coral reefs. And then I was asked in 2016 to do a specialty glass residency at Corning, which I spent most of my time at the Sullivan Park Research Center, which is just an enormous industrial research center. But I was also invited to work at the amphitheater at the museum that many of you have been to. And they have a special furnace there, which can melt very, very special high temp glass. So this glass on the right is actually it's a precursor to Gorilla Glass, or a first cousin of Gorilla Glass, which we all know from our cell phones, which was developed at Corning. And it, instead of, having a melt temperature of like 2,300 degrees, its melt temperature is above 3,000 degrees. So it's very hard to work with. And it also cools and gets hard very fast. Or actually, it doesn't cool very fast. It gets hard very fast. So it was really interesting for me to work with in this way, and for the blowers to work with. They were laughing all the time because they had such a short amount of time to work with it before they'd have to run back and reheat it in the furnace. So we were just trying the same kind of work to evaluate how this different body of glass behaved. And George and the team are wonderful, and they don't know how to make anything small. Well, they can, but if you say small, it means one thing to them, and what you get is big. And if you say, let's make a big piece, I got a piece that was almost 3 feet tall and weighed so much I could hardly carry it myself. So I don't know how they did it on the end of a blowpipe, except they're extremely gifted and strong. So you see, we were able with this glass to get layers and layers and layers on. So it really does look like a very intricate coral reef, which is one of my favorite things in the world. So, so here we are, just, crushing the thread, spreading it out, torching it into mats, and then laying it over the piece very quickly while it's hot, and immediately torching it on. And then I went back. Here I am back in Sullivan Park. Well, I'm standing back for a minute, and I was able to use incredible equipment there. This is, I think, one of the largest glass lathes in the world. And I was torching these bundles of thread together. I guess the closest thing I can relate it to is Pyrex, but it's much, much more so than Pyrex. And so we could be torching together one end, and the rest is still cold, and you can do that. Then we did have to put it in an annealing oven, but you can't really do this with any other form of glass. So when we were working, we were having to quickly take it out and turn it around and then torch the other end. And I said, couldn't we just, torch both ends at once? Like, can't you get another hydrogen torch? And we all have very special dark glasses on, because hydrogen torches will give you within a very short, seconds, will start to give you an ocular migraine, because it's so intensely bad for your eyes. So we had these really dark glasses on. This is Eric Goldschmidt. Some of you may know him, just sort of a lamp worker extraordinaire who was officially lent to me to work with. And then we were able to also do this in the amphitheater to demonstrate to a group coming through the museum. So it was, great fun, really wonderful activity. And And this is a shot through the end. And again, here we are, and it's almost identical to a cross section of a bird feather, the quill of a bird feather. So these relationships keep, popping up again and again. It was also fascinating to see. It felt somehow like working in the universe. This bottom left picture, I mean, very clearly you see both light and energy bending, which was really fascinating to me. And this is the piece Cold. So you see there starts to be, again, like a crystalline structure in the part that's been fused together with air still trapped. And this is just taken in another light. So you see very clearly the structure in the air spaces. And a cross section, so we could see really what was happening with the fusion. It was, many things happened that I couldn't have predicted. And the end result, after, many months of, evolving the process and developing and getting larger, at one point I went in, I took a smaller sample into the head of the program. He's the chief scientist at the research center. And he goes, it's really interesting. He said, now make it tall. So I thought, well, he's like 6'5". Is that what he means by tall? So that became the bar that I was shooting for, was to make these pieces like at least 6.5 feet long. So these pieces are all pretty much that length, and then fused and slumped. And we just played with them and laid them out in different configurations. So some of you may have seen this in the New Glass Now show that was at Corning a couple of years ago, that's now going to the Renwick. This can't go to the Renwick because it's, as you see, kind of too fragile to be moving around. But it's in it. The museum asked if they could buy it for their collection. I said, no, of course you can't. You just gave me 6 months of the most incredible experience and spent a fortune on me doing it. So I think it's yours. But what happened is, when I went back to my studio, I found that this kind of Pavlovian dog response kicked in, and I suddenly clicked back into, my old work. And I thought and I, I kept working, but then I realized I'm really kind of done with this series of work, but what's next now? And I went up to my parents' property, and well, my late parents' property up in the northeast of Massachusetts, which was really a wonderland to grow up in. Beautiful woodlands surrounded by an extensive marshland. So as children, we just were surrounded by an unbelievable variety of the most beautiful birds, both waterfowl, fowl, and woodland. And Audubon used to actually bring bird watching groups through our property because they had such a treat. In a very short amount of time, they saw so many birds, they couldn't believe it. But what happened was that when I went that day, I got halfway down through the woods and I realized I hadn't heard or seen a bird. And I thought, what's wrong? This isn't normal. And so I sat down and I was very quiet for a while, and still nothing appeared. And I thought, I'm just making too much noise. I'm a city slicker now. But I went all the way to the end of the property to a high ridge and looking out over the marshland. And I didn't see anything in the marshland either, which was very weird. And I got back to Providence, and I started just Googling all the birds that I remembered. And one after one, they were on the endangered species list. And these were birds that were really common when I was growing up. And in just, Googling them and looking at the amazing photos I found of them, like it was such a huge inspiration. And again, a reminder that the structure of their feathers is very similar to the structure of my pieces when I'm laying out all these fine separate pieces of glass. So I started researching And the more you click in endangered species, you're taken to every country, all over the world. And so I started being really inspired by these creatures, and I wanted to do something to remind the world that they were disappearing. So I embarked on a whole series of work called the Endangered Species series, and first and primarily of birds. So this is being my favorite bird, the Baltimore oriole. Luckily, it's not endangered everywhere, but it's very endangered where I came from. And I think still it's one of the most beautiful birds. It has one of the most beautiful songs. It builds the most extraordinary nest. I once, in 1954, I think it was, Hurricane Carol, which was one of the worst hurricanes that ever came through the Northeast. And it knocked down like hundreds of our pine trees. And as I was watching the pine trees, just being fallen like matchsticks in the field below our property, which in the woods below our property, which is now a field. I also watched the Baltimore oriole nest, which is a beautiful, very delicate looking hanging nest, being thrashed around through the air. They build them mostly on giant elms, so they're kind of hanging branches. So it was just being whipped around in these incredibly strong winds. And after the hurricane, the pine trees were, about 25% of our pine trees on the land were all down. And this Baltimore oriole nest was still there. And it just made me really start to ponder about how amazing these creatures are. I mean, besides the fact that they're beautiful and they can fly, they build these amazing nests that look like nothing, but they're actually extraordinary. So one of the first pieces was, of course, in honor of my favorite bird. And then, of course, bird after bird that came up as endangered. And this is one of my favorites. It's a mandarin duck, but it's related to the wood ducks that used to nest in one of our ponds. And so I rarely show slides of this, but I was asked to, since this is educational. So this is what I see when I'm starting a piece. And after this, it becomes a three-dimensional piece. You never see this, two-dimensional entire composition. So this is the piece, and then the beginning of the filling of the inside, which gives the piece its body and its strength, and also another overtone of color. So here, this is the resulting piece. So that became this. And if you look on the bottom right, you see this very similar feathering pattern that happens in my pieces because of the filigrana optics. And it's just been endlessly fascinating for me to look at the details of these birds. And because of modern photography and superb lenses, both telephoto lenses and really, really, high action photography stills, it captures things that you never really see with your naked eye, and these beautiful forms that birds take when they're in motion. This is an iiwi. It's from Hawaii. I started going state by state. Another unfortunately gorgeous but endangered bird. And after these were made in 2018, and it was just before the ice caps started melting, and penguins have now become an extremely endangered species, which is a shame. And they're so graphically beautiful. A beautiful woodpecker from the Iberian Peninsula. And this was one of my great discoveries, was the Guldian finches in Australia. I'd never heard of or seen them. And I saw the photos and I thought they couldn't be real. They were just so extraordinary and so beautiful and so varied. This is a South African finch. And the hardest thing to do, I find out, was to try and make like circles or dots. It's like the same problem that weavers have. It's hard to make a circle because you're always working. Basically, you're working with a grid, you're working with straight lines. But that's when I decided, well, I'm not trying to imitate what the bird looks like. I'm just like, it's a reference, a color reference, and sort of a reference to some of their patterning and the blocking of color. And I've done many versions of these birds because they're so beautiful, and depending on what image you're looking at of them, you see all these amazing new colors, and suddenly their wings are striped because the feathers are spread apart, and you're seeing the underside of them, or you're seeing them in combination. And here's another Gouldian finch. This is a double Gouldian finch. That's one on one side, and the other side of the piece is another color combination of the Gouldian finches. But they're very elaborate to do the overlays and multiple overlays like this of color. And then I discovered the fruit doves and in all their wondrous variations, and more Gouldian finches. This is an African bee eater. So this is the photo that inspired me, and the resulting piece from the flat that you saw. And this is a mannequin, and it's also a bird I had never seen. You can see, if you carefully look at this, the overlaying and the slight angle alteration that causes the feathering that happens. So this is the bird, which is such a sweetie, and this is the piece that I attempted. I mean, I don't think any of my attempts really come up to how beautiful the birds are, but I'm trying. And this is a pretty comprehensive layout. You see the evolution of how I'm thinking and laying out the piece as I'm laying out the piece, and overlaying the multiple overlays. And sometimes I purposely start doing the filler on the piece to block off what I've already done, because I don't want to be imitating it. I want to keep going and elaborating some of the patterning that I've seen of the bird, or just elaborating on the elaboration. And then part of the reason for the extra layers that are concentric in the center is that when these pieces are forming, they're upside down. And I discovered early on that if I didn't add more layers to that part of the piece, I wouldn't have enough material to stretch it. And one day I was in the kiln, and I had closed the kiln. I was waiting for it to stretch down some more, and all of a sudden I hear this funny sound, and I raised up the kiln, and there was a little cap of glass on the top, and then these fine strings of glass, and the whole piece was down at the bottom of the kiln. So I realized I needed to add more material if I was going to do that. So this is the piece before it gets its final form. You see, I've, the preforming of the edge, and there's the final piece, and there's the bird that it came from. I think this is a verdita flycatcher from India. And another fruit dove. Sort of extraordinary birds. Like, how does something get to look like that? It makes me feel like we're so unevolved as humans, because these creatures are so extraordinary and so beautifully colored. And a very sort of coquettish parrot. And this is what happens sometimes. Luckily, not too often. And this is a much larger piece. Someone had requested a large Gouldian finch. And I really sort of thought they should just be small, but I said, okay. And, it was worth a try. And we had a brownout in the the electricity in our district that night. And so when I came in the morning to continue working on the piece, because the second firings take much longer because they have to rise to temperature very slowly. So I came in to two pieces, and a kiln that had just gone awry. And it was heartbreaking because it takes a long time to lay these out. And I sent the photo to Doug Heller, who the commission was through, and he just sort of like sent me an email gasp back and said, can you do anything with this? And unfortunately, the answer is no. But I haven't been able to part with it because I love the graphics of it. So I did an exhibition on the West Coast, and I decided to focus. I had just read an article about, the devastation of the coral reefs around the world from pollution, global warming. And so I did these pieces that are like coral surrounded by, the beautiful water that they existed in, and had also recently experienced returning to a beautiful island in the Caribbean, which is where the first coral reef that I had ever dove in was, and was really looking forward to being there again. And the entire bay was nothing but white. All the coral was bleached to white and dead. And it was the most shocking experience. Well, the second most shocking. The first one was my first oil spill that I witnessed on one of my favorite beaches as a child. But to see that incredible reef, which was extraordinarily beautiful, and every possible kind of anemone, coral, sea fin, you name it, fish swimming around, it was just gone. So this piece is called Coral Bleach. And this one's black coral. And this is based on an anemone. It's quite a large piece, and anemone aren't this large, but I felt like I needed the scale to really incorporate all the color. So back to the birds. And just more research. I love doing the research. I've always loved doing research, but this is such a particular visual pleasure, this research. So more plum-headed parrots, because they're so beautiful, and they're a challenge too. It's always a challenge to do it better. And this is an emperor penguin. Another fruit dove. These are mostly from Australia. Another Gouldian finch, another beautiful variation. Whoops. Another fruit dove. And the orioles I always love doing another version of an oriole, because there's just endless possibilities. And this beautiful little kingfisher, when I saw this picture, I just thought, this can't be true, that something's really looking like this. And it's a tiny little bird. It's probably another fruit dove. Yep. I mean, the variation in these cousins and first cousins, and even within the very same group of birds, is pretty, it's really fascinating to look at and wonder how they get those slight variations of changes. When I was little, we never had, the only blue bird we had near us was a blue jay, and they weren't very nice. They're very aggressive birds. So I was fascinated by little blue birds. You keep hearing about bluebirds, and there are songs about bluebirds and everything. So I made this bluebird. This is a canvasback. We actually used to have Canadian canvasback ducks or geese migrating through our marshland. And this is a rare one. They're usually like kind of a pale grayish with a slight pinky tone to them. And an American eagle. I I felt at that point, this was in 2018, that the American eagle was one of the most symbolically endangered species on Earth. And interestingly, they were endangered at one point, and then they were protected and they came back. And then when oil drilling was allowed again in certain areas, they became endangered again. And it has a direct relationship with our democracy and the decisions that we make. This bird is fascinating to me for two reasons, because it's connected with one of my favorite creatures on the earth, which is a horseshoe crab. And it's a red knot. It's the longest migrating bird, and it stops only once between the two poles. And that's in Chesapeake Bay, and it feeds on horseshoe crab eggs. So, and it's a beautiful bird. This is a Canadian tanager for a show I did in Canada. I researched some Canadian birds. And then back to the tropics. So this is the same piece, recto verso. And again, it's, you know, I can't match what a bird looks like, but I work with it. You know, I use it to find new ways of making, of seeing myself, and of making different patterns and shapes with what I'm working with. This is a bird that I grew up with. It's a flicker. And again, impossible to make all the little dots on it. So I just like expanded and focus and enlarge parts of it and then abstract parts of it. And this is the resulting piece. Bird of paradise, of which there are many, 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 many forms and colors. Whoop. Purple finch. The cardinal, one of my favorite birds to watch, you know, flitting through my yard against all the green trees. And then I found this crazy bird called the Nicobar pigeon, which has some of the weirdest, most beautiful and varied feathering of any bird I've found. And I don't even think that I've come close to all this variation. So I'm gonna keep trying. And some birds are so incredibly graphic. And this is another bird I thought, this can't be true. Someone made this up. Someone photoshopped this bird together. This creature cannot exist. It's too weird. And it's true. It's a real bird. It's actually a form of hummingbird. It's called a short-crested coquette. So this is one of the pieces that I made, mostly just based on the colors. I was asked to make a bird from the region that, a piece based on some bird that was from the region that the people lived in. So I researched and I came up with a bird that my brothers and I love the names of. It's called the yellow-bellied sapsucker. And we used to use that to tease each other, like, you yellow-bellied sapsucker, you. But they really are beautiful, and they range from where I lived in northeastern Mass down south. So this piece was the result of that investigation. Another Nicobar pigeon. And again, you see another extraordinary photograph of the feathering of these birds and the coloration. Then someone sent me a photograph of this bird, and I went, no, this is too outrageous. I can't possibly work with that. It looks like a Christmas ornament gone awry. But then I started looking at many different photos of it in different positions. And so I came up with this very brightly colored piece on the left. And another Oriole. And this is one of the, actually, this is one of the last pieces that I made before we had to start moving the studio. And it was kind of a fight to the finish to do that. And it's a very big piece. And this is just the evolution of the layout of the piece with an interior layer crossing that's a translucent white to preserve all the colors differences on the outside and to make sure they remain really brilliant, because the inside is just a transparent. And there's, I think it's a red and yellow barbet or something. So there's the resulting piece. And that might be the last piece. Up, up, up. One more. And that's the last piece I have to show you.
Thank you so much, Toots. Really just incredible. The confluence of form and color and light is incredibly magical in your work. And I know we have a lot of questions from the group for you. Just a brief mention before we get started with that. We do have a hard stop at 3:45 Eastern for Toots. So I think we should be able to get through the questions in that time. But if we stop suddenly, that is the reason why. So Toots, why don't you please go ahead and stop your screen share, and then I'll have Howard spotlight you and we can get started. I'll start reading off the Q&A from the chat.
Okay.
All right, so let's see. The first question is, did you invent the thread pulling machine?
I co-invented the thread pulling machine with my friend, the late, unfortunately, Matthijs Teunissen van Manen from Holland.
And we did have someone ask about cleaning, which I think you showed us, just with the high-powered spray water is the best method for that.
Yeah. I mean, there was one point when I didn't quite have a studio. I had part of my studio at my house, and I would take a bunch of towels and put them out on the lawn and blast them with my lawn hose at a really high pressure. So it kind of accomplished two things at once. It cleaned the piece and it watered my lawn. But it's a really good way to clean them. I mean, you could put a lot of towels in a bathtub, and if you have a sprayer, and spray it like that.
Okay. Someone says you don't
vacuum them. You can vacuum them really carefully.
That's a good idea too. Yeah. Someone says you don't seem to use any kiln wash on the steel bowls. Do you have problems with it?
Good question. No, kiln wash was a problem. In fact, kiln wash was a problem from the very beginning, because most people doing fusing and slumping use, traditionally used like kiln shelves, which are very hard ceramic, and coat them with kiln wash. But no matter what you make the kiln wash out of, it's gonna get fine crackling in it. And that was, well, and it's flat. It flattened the threads, which is not what I wanted, but it also made these fine little, chisel marks, and that wasn't what I wanted either. So I remembered that Albinus Elsketh, who was a wonderful stained glass artist, had given a workshop at New York Experimental Glass Workshop when we built the second New York Experimental Glass Workshop, which then of course became Urban Glass. And he was double firing panes of glass, which he had painted enamel on, and then he'd let it dry and he'd turn it over and he'd enamel the other side. And he did that by putting them on a bed of plaster. And he could fire both sides at the same time without like messing it up. And I remembered that and I went, wait a minute. But the plaster, for what I was doing, I had to go to a higher temperature than just firing on enamel. And so it left, little marks. Glass is the most perfect, it takes every tiny little mark that is in a mold, which is on the one hand a great thing, and on the other hand can be a real problem. And so I had an extra fluorescent light tube in my studio, and I thought, well, let's make a good rolling pin. So I used it to roll the plaster out on top of this ceramic fiber board, which is lighter and it's more of a refractory, meaning it will absorb heat but not give it back out. Because when you pick a hot kiln shelf out of the kiln, even with, of course, with gloves on, you'll burn through the gloves in no time. And it's just too hot to work with. And by using the compressed plaster, which I sift on with a flour sifter, by using the compressed plaster, every time, I put threads down, then it makes its own palimpsest. So I preserve the texture of the threads on the outside of the piece too. By the way, I should have pointed out that over the compressed plaster, I put a sheet of very, very, very fine rice paper called gampishi or gamshi. It's what they use when they're restoring fine paintings. You might have, if you've ever seen images or actually a fine painting under restoration, you might see little patches of fine white paper. That's gampishi paper. And the reason that it works so well for me is that, first of all, it burns away completely clean. It doesn't leave a carbon residue, which mystified me until that was explained to me recently. And gampishi, even when you hold it up to the light, there's not even a tiny, tiny pinhole. It's perfectly flat, even rice paper with no holes. So the plaster can't even powder up through it, which is really important for my work, because if the plaster starts powdering up through the threads, they're not going to fuse together.
Right.
So the reason that gampishi, I found out, doesn't leave, I never needed really to know why. The reason it doesn't leave a carbon residue, because rice is an organic material, right? It's organic matter. No, it's not. Rice is pure silica. And that's why when it burns, it doesn't give a carbon residue.
Oh,
Because
interesting.
and normally anything else you would use would leave a black carbon residue or ashes. So that was really interesting.
That is very interesting.
Yeah.
As
So
you,
it's ceramic fiber board, pre-fired sculpting, fine sculpting plaster, sieved through it like a fine sieve, then rolling it out with a fluorescent tube, and then a layer of rice paper over it, and then you're good to go. So it leaves a very, very, very fine film of plaster on the outside of the piece, so that I don't need, which then washes off, but I don't need then a resist on my forms, which are stainless steel. They get somewhat corroded, obviously, but they're originally stainless steel, which makes a huge difference. Regular steel will just flake. Stainless steel doesn't do that. But because of the plaster, then when the piece is slumping down in, it won't stick to the mold. And the stainless steel mold is so thin that it doesn't affect your annealing time. And it's all very specific to my work. I mean, you have to figure out what works for the kind of work you're trying to do. And it's often a lot of trial and error, or asking questions to other people who have gone through the trial and error process.
very interesting. Thank you for that information. As you're working with color in your pieces, is working with proportions, I know you talked a little bit about the use of transparent versus opaque. Is there any sort of formula you use regarding proportions, or are you really just sort of painting with glass in a way?
I'm painting with glass.
Okay.
And when I started working with it, with this glass, I very specifically wanted opaque glass. this sounds really funny to say, but I love glass, and I also never liked that it was hard and shiny. And that, when you were working with transparent glass, and I was making larger sculptures and stuff then early on, it disturbed me, all the, the reflections and seeing through it and seeing what was on the other side of it. And I always sandblasted. A lot of the original work I did had no color, and it was sandblasted because I just wanted the form, and I wanted that light to be captured, which glass does better than anything else. But I didn't want the distraction of all the reflections. Mm-hmm. And glass does that beautifully. I mean, translucent glass does it beautifully. So when I started working with glass, it was primarily opaque. I loved that glass never fades. I mean, it's one of the only substances that will never fade. So the colors will be as pure now in a few hundred years or 1,000 years, depending on where they've been kept. And I love that quality of it. And I started really studying paintings and color for the first time in my life. And it was great because I was in Europe, and I had like 10 museums that were, 5-10 minutes from my place on a bicycle in Holland. And I could just, and galleries of contemporary art and museums of contemporary and classical and everything you can imagine. So I would just go and study paintings because there they were in reality, not in a book. And so it was just, and I really did a lot of studying of birds even then. My first series were based on birds because I was learning about color, and my combinations were very primary at first. And then I started elaborating, and then I started thinking, you're working with glass, I can't mix color like you can mix paint, but I can physically mix the threads because they're so fine. And I get, depending on your focus, you can see when you're close up that there's a blue thread next to an orange thread, but at a distance, those colors are literally combining in the air. And what you're seeing is a combination. You're seeing a purplish color instead, until you get close and you realize that it's this really fine combination, physical combination of threads. And then, needing more color and thinking there have to be more colors in the universe. Are there? I run out of color, and then I start, I thought, well, you're working with glass, you can start overlaying and getting those muddy in between colors that no one's going to make on purpose, but you need them when you're combining many colors. You often need a yucky color in between, because 2 or 3 colors in a row side by side can suddenly kill each other, and you often need something just sort of in between so that they pop. Did I answer that question?
You did, yes. And we have a lot of comments. I'll send you a copy of the chat later so you can see the comments that people are making about the bird series, but we do have some questions in particular about it. At what year did you start creating the work inspired by birds? And a lot of comments about wanting to see this documented in print as well.
My own series of the endangered species, I started in early 2018. Then it was interesting because that was the first show I did. Then I did another show in March of 2020, March 5th, that opened a week before the pandemic shut down New York. And it was immediately after that incredible study came out that they've been studying for the past 50 years, the bird populations in North America alone. In the past 50 years, from 1970 to 2020, we've lost 3 billion birds. That's 25% of our entire bird population in North America alone. And it's just mind-boggling. I mean, imagine 3 billion birds in the sky at once. I mean, that would kind of blacken the sky. And we've lost that many. And it's kind of like the canary in the mine. Like, are we not paying attention to what we're doing? How can anybody believe that global warming is not true? And environmental, pollution, because we're just sort of rapidly destroying some of our very most beautiful and vulnerable creatures on the earth, and including ourselves.
We do have a question from someone wanting to know that when someone purchases one of your works, do they get the image of the bird along with the piece?
If they'd like.
Okay.
I think I know Doug Heller sends people the image of the bird if they want it.
Yeah, we have a lot of suggestions from folks that would really like to see a book that really documents and highlights your work and also brings attention to the endangered species. We have a few more questions regarding process as well, including whether you always start with a circular template and how does the shape of the bird affect the shape that the final piece takes?
All the pieces start, well, all of these pieces start with a circular or an oval template of, varying sizes. But then the form, each piece has its own very specific form. And sometimes I choose not to pre-curl the edge, and depending on the bird, and I go in by hand in the second slumping and giving it more subtle curves so the bird is more sleek. And the height or the stretching of the piece varies with each piece, and it's very specific. There's nothing accidental about my work. It's, if there's a curve there, or then the neck of it is this long or this long, it's because I've made it that way. It's because I've set up that the forms that it's going to slump over specifically so that it's a certain height, a certain shape. And that isn't to say that there's not spontaneity involved, or there's not always like 100% predetermination of everything. There's a lot of spontaneity involved. I mean, you have to be willing, working with, especially with glass, because it's moving. It's a very live material. It's always moving when you're working with it, and you have to work with that. It's a cooperation, it's a collaboration. And sometimes the glass starts doing something that you hadn't previewed, but it's maybe better than what you previewed. And so you immediately make a decision whether it's better or not. And you either go with it and then, keep it going, or you stop it. But everything's very predetermined. I mean, there's a lot of predetermination or spontaneous action. I'm not closing up a kiln and letting the piece do what it wants to do and opening it the next morning and going, oh, I wonder what I'm going to find. No. I'm much too much of a control freak to let that happen.
We also, I know you spoke a little bit about some of your experimentation you had to do because of the density required for your pieces to accommodate for the stretching and various aspects. Someone is asking, how many layers do you typically use in your work?
Well, it depends on the size of the piece. If it's a small piece, it gets fewer layers, obviously. The larger pieces, I don't know. There's the main layer, what I'll call the main layer, is probably 30 threads thick, something like that. But then the inner circles, the concentric circles or concentric ovals, which allow me to stretch that part of the piece as much as I want to, are then thicker. There's more layers right there, probably 10 more layers or something.
Okay, we have a couple questions also about where you will be moving forward with your work from here. Continuing more of the bird forms. Are there other species that you're interested in? I know you expressed a love for coral. So maybe elaborate a little bit there, please.
Well, unfortunately, there's an endless supply of a referential material now for endangered species, both in the ocean and in the air, and on land. So I don't know where it's going to take me. I'm not done with the birds. I wish I were. I wish I could say, okay, there's no more endangered species. I'm done. But that's not true at all. In fact, as we stand right now, and endangered is relative to how we measure and what we think should be a normal amount or an acceptable amount. But I remember in Africa, when I was living in Ghana, we were in this beautiful low region, and there was these endless sort of wetland fields, and there were a lot of white egrets across them, like, I don't know, a lot. And I made a comment to an old man from that village, and I said, wow, you have so many egrets, it's so beautiful. I haven't seen these many in one place since I was a child. And he said, oh, they're all gone. He said, this is nothing. He said, when they landed before, you couldn't see the field. So it's everywhere. So when did we start counting, and what is endangered? But right now, basically the whole earth is endangered. So we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a shame. I mean, look what's surviving, on the other hand, are the toughest birds. Like, it used to be nice to see a Canada goose. Now, who wants to see a Canada goose? Like, they're a nuisance. And they've pushed away all the other more vulnerable birds. They've pushed them out of their habitats because they're the strongest survivors. Or pigeons or sparrows or starlings. I mean, they push out the more delicate, beautiful birds. So we're not only losing so many birds, but we're losing more and more of the fine, more delicate ones.
Yeah.
And then, that's prejudicial too. Like, who's to say a brown bird isn't as nice as a red bird, but I personally would rather see a red bird flitting across in front of my eyes just because it's prettier, and maybe because it's more rare, who knows?
Well, there's certainly an incredible wealth of information to study, and I can see how passionate you are about this, which is really inspiring to all of us. I think I'll close with just one final question that someone had regarding your process. Tina says, do you mind sharing where you get your rice paper and what specific paper you get?
I get a rice paper called Gampishi. You can buy it in a lot of paper stores, or Gamshi, I think it's also called. I actually, if she goes to my website and writes me, there's a contact me on my website, tootsynsky.com. If she writes me and asks me, my former studio assistant combined, Haruwe Shimamoto, actually found a source for me directly in Japan, so I can get wide rolls of it, because the widest I could get here when I moved here to the States is cut into smaller pieces that are too small for my largest pieces. In Holland, I could get larger sheets of it. If she writes to me, I can find out, because I give Haruwe my credit card and she orders it. It's one small maker in Japan that we get it from in rolls. So I can kind of have bigger pieces if I want. If she writes to me and asks me that, I'll try and find the actual address.
Thank you.
But you could also go to your local museum, and if there's a painting conservationist, if they have a painting conservation department, they would know where to find it too. Although they're usually working in, cutting and using smaller pieces to, I guess, to mask off parts of the painting when they're working on it, or I'm not sure exactly how or why they use it. I've just seen them using it.
Okay.
I'm also, to answer where my work is going, I've received 2 commissions for wall pieces, which are going to be based on ocean.
Oh, wow.
Ocean.
Very excited to see those, and thank
So
you
am
again. You just have been so generous today with your knowledge, sharing not only your process, but your really heartfelt passion for such an important topic. And we're so grateful that you were willing to come today and share with us. So thank you very, very much, Toots, for being with us today.
My pleasure, and it's really nice to see so many familiar faces. I miss you all. One of the big things I miss about all the big shows, especially like South Chicago and Art Miami and wherever they are, is that getting to see people from all over the country, in 5 days' time, that otherwise to see them you'd be spending months traveling around the country to see, and so it's such a wonderful celebratory gathering. So I really do miss you all, and it's thank you for joining today.
I'll go ahead and stop the recording now, and if anyone wants to